They put a locked steel gate across my only access road. And the strange part is, they looked me in the eye and told me it wasn't blocking anything. I still remember standing there in my truck, engine idling, staring at that gate like my brain was refusing to accept what I was seeing. Because that road, that wasn't just a path through the woods. That was the only legal artery connecting my land to the outside world, and someone had just decided to put a wall across it like my history there didn't matter. My name is Caleb Morgan, and I own a stretch of timberland up in northern Vermont, almost 80 acres of dense, old forest that my father once called quiet money, because it didn't look like much from the outside, but it kept the life I built steady: logging rights, seasonal hunting leases, a few long-term agreements with local operators who knew how to respect the land. The road in question had been there since the 1950s, carved out long before I was born, and my deed didn't just mention it. It guaranteed it. Unrestricted right-of-way, no conditions, no permissions needed, just access, plain and simple. For 15 years, everything worked exactly the way rural land is supposed to work when people respect history. You nod at your neighbors, you wave at the trucks, you fix what you break, and nobody tries to reinvent what already functions. That changed the year Evan Whitlock and his wife Marissa moved in. They came from Boston, which in itself isn't a problem. People move all the time. But there's a certain kind of buyer who doesn't see land as something inherited from time. They see it as something to redesign, optimize, and control, like they're correcting a mistake nature made. They bought the front parcel that my access road crossed, the first stretch of land before my property even began, and they paid cash, fast, no hesitation, like they already had a plan in motion before the ink dried. I met Evan once, early on, one of those accidental encounters you don't think much about at the time. I was hauling timber out, dust on my boots, radio playing low in the cab, and he was standing near the edge of the road with a coffee cup in his hand, smiling like he was trying to fit into a postcard. He waved me down, asked what kind of operation I was running back there, and I told him straight: timber, leases, a working forest, and he nodded like he understood, like he respected it even. "Beautiful land you've got back there," he said, and I remember thinking, yeah, it is, but beauty out here isn't decoration, it's responsibility. I didn't think about him again for a while. Weeks passed, maybe 3, maybe 4, and then I came down that same road one morning just after sunrise. Mist still sitting low between the trees, everything quiet in that way only deep forest mornings can be, and that's when I saw it. A gate, not a fence, not a sign, a full industrial steel gate, 8 feet tall, black metal bars, anchored into stone pillars like it had always belonged there, keypad on the side, security cameras pointed directly at the road like it was guarding something valuable instead of blocking something legal. I actually stopped the truck and just stared for a few seconds, trying to convince myself it was temporary, construction-related, maybe a mistake. It wasn't. I called Evan right there, hands still on the wheel, and when he picked up he sounded almost cheerful, like I was calling about something routine. I told him I couldn't pass, that he had put a gate across a registered right-of-way, and there was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to feel the shift before he even spoke. Then he said, "Oh yeah, the gate. That's just for security. Marissa feels safer that way. Don't worry, we can give you the code." And I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because my brain couldn't decide if I was being insulted or tested. I told him clearly, no code, no conditions. The easement is unrestricted. That means no barriers, no access control, nothing that turns a right into a permission. His tone changed immediately, subtle but sharp, like a door closing. He said something like, "We paid for privacy out here. Caleb, we're just trying to make a safe home. You can still get through." And I told him, that's not how rights work. And that was the first time the silence between us felt like pressure instead of space. After that call, I didn't argue further with him directly. I went to someone who actually understands land law in rural places like this, a man named Richard Halden, older attorney, the kind of guy who spent 40 years reading deeds like their weather reports, knowing when a storm is coming before anyone else notices the clouds. I laid everything out for him: the road, the gate, the wording in the deed, and he didn't hesitate. He leaned back, looked at me like I was already halfway right, and said, "Unrestricted easement means exactly that, Caleb. No gate, no keypad, no conditional access. If they don't remove it voluntarily, You have the legal right to clear the obstruction. That sentence should have felt like relief, but instead it felt like a line being drawn in the dirt. Richard sent a formal notice to Evan. 10 days. Remove the gate or face injunction. We expected negotiation, maybe resistance, but what came back wasn't compromise. It was defiance wrapped in polished legal language from a Boston firm claiming the gate didn't actually restrict access because I had been offered entry credentials. They even used that phrase, entry credentials, like my grandfather's land had turned into a corporate office building. They suggested we formalize an agreement, define usage hours, maintenance responsibilities, even liability clauses, and I remember reading that letter twice, slowly, thinking how far people can drift from reality when they start believing ownership means control over everyone else's history. Richard filed for injunction immediately. While that was moving through court, something else started happening that made the whole situation worse in a quieter, more irritating way. Evan's construction crews began using the same access road heavily, hauling materials for their new house, trucks grinding through gravel, widening ruts, breaking drainage lines I had maintained for years. I tried to talk to him again once, met him near the gate early one morning, and he didn't even get out of his truck. He just rolled down the window slightly and said, "Our lawyer says we're not responsible for maintenance until this is resolved." And then he drove off like that, ended the conversation. That's when I realized this wasn't just ignorance. It was a strategy. Turn everything into a legal fog so basic respect doesn't have to apply anymore. A few weeks later, the case finally reached Judge Miriam Colton, a woman known locally for not wasting time on performative arguments. She grew up in a logging town herself, and I think that mattered more than anything else in that courtroom. She listened, she read, she asked 2 questions, and then she said it plainly. The easement is unrestricted. The gate is unlawful. You have 14 days to remove it voluntarily. After that, the plaintiff is authorized to remove the obstruction and recover reasonable costs. 14 days. That was the whole story, reduced to a countdown. When I heard it, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt quiet, because I knew what comes next in rural disputes isn't law anymore. It's execution. And Evan Whitlock, he didn't remove the gate. Not on day 1, not on day 10. Trucks still came and went behind it. Cameras still blinked in the forest like silent accusations. On day 14, nothing changed. And that's where this story really begins to shift from paperwork to something you can hear, feel, and eventually see from the inside of a machine. Because on the morning of day 15, I showed up at that gate with a bulldozer, and I wasn't alone, and I wasn't guessing. I was acting under a court order that had already decided what was right, or at least what was enforceable. But what happened next, the sound of steel meeting force, the moment Evan realized I wasn't bluffing, the way a property dispute turns into something permanent in a matter of minutes. That's where everything escalated beyond anything either of us expected. And I'll tell you exactly how it unfolded, but you'll need to hear what happened on that day very carefully, because nothing about it was clean, and nobody walked away unchanged. By the time I pulled off the main gravel cut and into sight of that gate again, I could already feel how wrong the air had gotten, not in a dramatic way. Just that quiet heaviness you get when something has been sitting unresolved too long, like the land itself is waiting for someone to finally stop pretending. The bulldozer sat on the lowboy trailer behind me, chained down. Diesel still warm from the morning prep, and Pete was riding shotgun in my truck, a local contractor who didn't ask too many questions because out here, people learn early that most questions already have answers you don't want to complicate. We weren't there to start a fight. We were there to enforce a court order. But I'll be honest, there's a psychological line you cross when you bring heavy equipment to someone else's property boundary, even when you're legally right, even when a judge has already signed off on it. Because law on paper doesn't always match the reality of standing in front of 8 feet of steel and stone that someone built thinking it would stop you forever. Richard was already waiting when we arrived, parked slightly off the road with his old pickup, windows down, clipboard on the passenger seat like he was documenting weather instead of conflict. He gave me a nod, not encouraging, not discouraging, just acknowledging that the moment had arrived. We had notified the sheriff's office the day before, not because we expected violence, but because rural law enforcement prefers to be present when property boundaries turn into physical actions. It keeps everyone honest. It keeps everyone alive. And then there it was, Evan Whitlock's gate, still standing exactly like it had been built to stand forever, black steel bars catching the morning light in a way that made it look more permanent than it had any right to be. Cameras were still there, tiny red lights blinking like they were watching something important. And for a second, I remember thinking how strange it is that humans build these symbols of control when nature doesn't recognize any of them. Pete climbed into the dozer first, calm hands, no theatrics, just routine. He'd done removals before, barns, illegal barricades, old fencing that crossed survey lines. But even he paused for half a second before starting the engine, like his body was reminding him that this one had weight beyond construction. The diesel roared awake, deep and steady, vibrating through the ground in a way that made the birds shift in the trees. And I remember standing there, arms crossed, not angry anymore, just focused, because anger burns fast, but focus is what's left when decisions have already been made somewhere else. We gave it one last attempt, not because we expected a different outcome, but because Richard insisted on formality. He walked up to the gate, called Evan's number, put it on speaker, and when Evan answered, his voice came through like nothing had changed at all. "You're really doing this?" he asked, almost amused, like we were children about to break a toy. Richard spoke calmly. "Reading from the order, 14 days have expired. Lawful removal is authorized. Final notice." There was a pause. Then Evan laughed, just once, short and sharp. "So you're really sending a bulldozer onto my property?" he said, and Richard replied, "No, sir. We are removing an unlawful obstruction from a recorded easement." And there was something about the way he said it that stripped all emotion out of the sentence, like it wasn't personal at all, just physics. That's when Evan's tone shifted again, sharper now, defensive. "This is going to cost you. All of you. I hope you know that." And Richard didn't respond to that, because threats don't change court orders. Pete signaled me from the cab. It was time. The dozer moved forward slowly at first, almost respectful in its approach, like even machinery understands thresholds. The ground under the blade compressed, gravel grinding, tires of the gate's foundation structure already resisting in that stubborn way engineered things do when they believe they were built to last longer than consequences. The first contact wasn't dramatic. It was almost quiet, a deep metallic groan as steel met steel, like the gate itself was trying to decide if this was real or just pressure. Then the pressure increased. You could hear it change tone, from resistance to strain, from strain to failure. One of the stone pillars cracked first, not explosively, just a long fracture line running through it like the earth had finally decided to open a file it had been holding closed. The cameras flickered. One of them popped with a small spark, and suddenly the idea of surveillance felt very small compared to what was happening in front of it. I remember stepping back without thinking, not out of fear, but because your body naturally respects destruction even when you authorize it. Pete kept pushing, steady hands, no aggression, just controlled force, and the gate began to fold inward, not like metal breaking, but like something surrendering under a decision it could no longer negotiate with. And then, just like that, it was over faster than any of us expected. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe less, but time stretches strangely when something irreversible is happening. What had been a symbol of control, of privacy, of ownership turned into twisted steel resting in the dirt like it had never meant anything more than temporary resistance. The road behind it was exposed again, raw and familiar, like it had been waiting for this exact moment to breathe. Silence followed. Not peaceful silence, just the absence of argument. That's when we heard vehicles. Evan and Marissa came down the road from the house, fast, dust trailing behind them, and they stopped the moment they saw what was left of the gate. Evan got out first, face already red, not from sadness, but from that immediate human reaction when your decisions meet consequences you didn't emotionally prepare for. "What did you do?" he shouted, walking toward us like volume alone could reverse time. I didn't answer immediately. I just handed him the court order, folded, slightly worn from my pocket, and he didn't even take it at first, like touching it would make it real in a way he couldn't argue with. Marissa stayed back near the truck, arms crossed, watching the scene like she was trying to find a version of it where they were still in control. Evan finally took the paper, scanned it, and I could see the moment understanding hit him, not all at once, but in layers, like each sentence was removing another excuse. "You could have worked with us," he said quietly now, almost disappointed. And I remember thinking how often people say that when they really mean, "You should have accepted my version of reality." Richard stepped forward then, calm as ever, and said, "We tried." The court decided. Evan turned to him, voice tightening again, "This isn't over." And Richard simply replied, "Legally, it is." There's a difference between those two sentences that most people don't understand until they live it. We left the gate behind that day, or what was left of it. And for the first time in weeks, the road felt normal again under my tires as I drove back out toward the highway. But even then, I knew this wasn't just about a gate anymore. It was about what happens when two completely different definitions of ownership collide, one built on history and legal continuity, the other built on reinvention and control. And the part that stayed with me wasn't the destruction itself. It was how quickly people can turn something shared into something contested, and how hard it is to walk that back once it starts. But what I didn't expect was that the story wasn't finished with the bulldozer, because the legal aftermath, the countersuit, the damage claims, and the final ruling would reveal something even more uncomfortable about how these rural land disputes really end, and who actually pays for the illusion of control. They say conflict ends when the law speaks, but out here, I learned something different. The law doesn't always end conflict. It just decides what happens after the damage is already done. A week after the gate came down, I thought things would finally settle, that the forest would go back to being just forest again, trucks moving, roads quiet, business as usual. But instead, I started getting letters, thick envelopes from Evan Whitlock's attorneys in Boston, the kind of writing that sounds powerful until you realize it's just language trying to rebuild something reality already broke. They accused me of trespass, property destruction, unlawful interference, even tried to frame the removal of the gate as something excessive, almost like they were rewriting the story where the obstruction itself didn't exist. Richard read it once, leaned back in his chair, and said, "They're trying to turn consequences into damages." And that sentence stuck with me more than anything else in the case. Because that's what it was really about now, not the gate, not the road, but who gets to define what responsibility looks like after a decision has already been made. Meanwhile, something interesting started happening on the ground. Evan's construction slowed, then stopped entirely. Without that access road functioning the way it used to, hauling materials became a nightmare, trucks getting stuck in ruts they themselves had created, delivery schedules collapsing, workers standing around waiting for instructions that never really fixed anything. I drove by one morning just to check the entrance, not because I wanted to see him fail, but because I wanted to see if the situation had stabilized, and I saw Evan standing there alone, hands in his pockets, looking down the same stretch of road like it had personally betrayed him. No gate anymore, no cameras, just open land. And somehow that made it worse for him, because now there was nothing left to blame except the structure of the situation itself. The court date came a few weeks later. Same courthouse, same judge, Miriam Colton, and you could feel from the start that this wasn't going to be a complicated decision for her. Evan's lawyer tried to build a narrative around safety concerns, privacy expectations, construction disruption, all the modern language people use when they want emotional arguments to override written deeds. But every time he spoke, it kept coming back to one simple fact. There was an easement, it was unrestricted, and it had been obstructed. Richard didn't argue much. He didn't need to. He just laid out the timeline, the notice, the court order, and the failure to comply. At one point, the judge stopped everything and asked, "Was the gate removed within the ordered time frame?" And Evan's attorney hesitated just long enough for everyone in the room to understand the answer. When the ruling came, it wasn't dramatic, no raised voice, no theatrical moment, just a calm confirmation of what the paperwork had already decided. The counterclaim was dismissed, the original order upheld, and Evan was required to pay legal fees plus repair costs for the damage caused by his construction activity on the access road. I remember expecting to feel something bigger in that moment, satisfaction maybe, relief, anger fading into closure, but what I felt instead was just quiet. Because in real life, victories like that don't feel like winning, they feel like things being put back where they always should have been. After court, Evan didn't speak right away. He stood outside the building for a while, just looking out at the parking lot like he was trying to find a version of events where the outcome could be rearranged by reconsideration. When he finally approached, there wasn't hostility anymore, just exhaustion. "I thought we were improving the property," he said. not as an accusation, more like a confession that didn't know where to go. I remember nodding and saying, "You can improve what you own, but you can't redesign what you only pass through." He didn't respond to that. Marissa stayed behind him, quiet, watching, and I could tell she understood something he didn't want to say out loud, that the cost of control is often paid in ways you don't see until it's already gone. A few weeks later, I found out the property had been listed for sale. No announcement, no explanation, just quietly entering the market like a chapter closing without needing permission. I drove past one last time before winter set in. The road open again. No gate, no cameras, just forest and gravel and the same access that had existed long before any of us had opinions about it. And that's what stayed with me most, not the destruction, not the lawsuit, not even the conflict itself, but how quickly people can move into a place and believe they can override its history with intention alone, and how quickly the land reminds them otherwise. I don't know what Evan tells himself about what happened. Maybe he still thinks it could have been handled differently. Maybe he thinks I escalated something that didn't need escalation. But from where I stood, it was never about escalation. It was about enforcement, about whether a right is still a right when someone decides it's inconvenient. And I think that question matters more than this one case, because it happens everywhere, in small ways, all the time. Fences, driveways, shared roads, lines on paper that only mean something when someone decides to respect them. So I'll leave it there with a simple question, because I'm genuinely curious how others see it. If you were in my position, standing in front of a locked gate across your only legal access, would you wait it out, negotiate, or do exactly what the court eventually authorized me to do? And more importantly, at what point does security stop being a reason and start becoming an excuse?